December 2019, we began a monumental task, one that had not been undertaken for over 70 years, standing up a new military service. Our Guardians have done a lot already in nearly 4 years, and 2023 was a banner year for many of these efforts. But we're not done yet. We have more units being activated, more missions coming online, more personnel interested in being part of the Space Force than ever before. We have the most talented workforce, the most technologically advanced and innovative service on the face of the earth. And we are going to continue to forge a purpose-built Space Force, laser-focused on securing our nation's interests in, from, and to space. So get ready.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special Space Warfighter Talk. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, and I'm honored to be here in Reston, Virginia, at AIAA headquarters, who's our partner for this event, to be discussing very important Personnel Management Act initiatives with Brigadier General Dave Yates from the United States Space Force. General Yates, thanks so much for being with us today.
Bill, thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
Now, the title that you have in your current position is quite a lengthy title.
It is.
Can you describe your role in the United States Space Force?
So I'm currently the Mobilization Assistant to the Chief Operations Officer, or the Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Operations Cyber and Nuclear. So it's a position at the staff at the Pentagon, and in that function I'm the senior reservist that advises the Chief Operations Officer on all things space, cyber, and intel operations for the Space Force.
Very interesting. A lot of discussion going on right now about the Space Force Personnel Management Act. And I, for one, as a space operator in the Air Force, know how many resources are needed to ensure that the Space Force has the ability to accomplish its space superiority mission. And I wrote an article that was published in The Hill a couple of years ago that talked about how the Space Force is less than a numbered Air Force in terms of manpower. How can you do all of those things with such a limited manpower base? You know, that's one of the things that I'm sure is on a lot of people's mind, but really what we want to focus on is how the Personnel Management Act is actually being implemented. And then really what I think is an interesting discussion is your background and how you're perfectly suited to help foster in these new initiatives into the Space Force. So let's start with your career. How did it start? I mean, we started in missiles 30 years ago. So it's great to see you again here working in the Space Force.
It's great to spend time with an old colleague, not to imply that you're old, Bill, but yeah. My first assignment was at Malmstrom with you, doing missile launch operations. From then, I went into the space business. So I did satellite command and control down at Schriever. And after that point, I transitioned into the reserve and had several space assignments at various levels, including here at the Pentagon and back in Colorado in command of a squadron. And at some point along the way, it transitioned back into a full-time status. So you're definitely right in saying that I've kind of had the experience of going from a full-time to a part-time back to a full-time again in several transitions along the way. So it's a very valuable experience. And that's set me up well to be the Personnel Management Act implementation lead for the Space Force under the Chief Human Capital Officer.
Perfect. And then talk a little bit about how you transitioned from full-time, part-time status, just as a reference, when you were working in the reserves. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the reserve, as you're aware, has categories of service. So there are traditional reservists in the Air Force Reserve. There are individual mobilization augmentees, which have a slightly different participation schedule and focus, mobility requirements and such. There are also some full-time statuses, so AGRs and ARTs, that have a primary function of enabling training and organization and all the admin responsibilities for the traditional reservists so they're able to perform their mission. So the units are structured as such, and there are also reservists that are embedded in, now this is just the Air Force model. I found doing a lot of research over the last intervening years on how the reserve works, that every service does it a little bit differently. But that IMA model of embedding folks, reservists, directly into Air Force and Space Force organizations is another service model as well.
Yeah, so then I'm sure the obvious discussion point that you've been researching is figuring out, does that model work and how is that model going to be different? So before we dive into that, really let's talk a little bit about the history of the Space Force Personnel Management Act. So for our audience, can you just explain in your words what it is and what it does for the Space Force?
Yeah, so the Personnel Management Act was enacted in the fiscal year 24 National Defense Authorization Act. So really, this past December is when that was approved by Congress. And it authorizes the Space Force to do quite a number of things. I think the most visible of those things is to have a service without component. So the traditional services have a regular component and a reserve component. And the Space Force under the Personnel Management Act does not have that structure. But what it is authorized to do is have a service without component in which guardians may serve in work roles that are full-time, which is familiar to guardians serving today on active duty, but also in a part-time work role, which is maybe similar but different in a lot of ways from service in the reserve. So there are some interrelated concepts there, but it's really a completely new model of service. We are still calling it the Personnel Management Act, although that was the legislation that was passed to enact it. But it's, what is it? It's just the Space Force. It is how the Space Force will do business from this point on in terms of how it manages its personnel.
And how is that different than traditional reserve and guard construct? Can you explain a little bit how the single componency will be move away from how we've been doing things in the past?
Yeah, let me explain why the Space Force did it, why the Department of Defense wanted this, why Congress enacted this legislation to make this happen. I think there's really two fundamental reasons why, and that will kind of answer your question of how's it different and what is it good for. The first reason was that the Space Force is a very focused service, obviously new, having been recently established. Small, but that's not the real reason. It's the focus on operations. Everyone in the Space Force is inherently operational. So all the military guardians, and really as well the civilian guardians as well, have an operational focus in space operations or cyber operations or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. Because of that focus and because of the changing threat in the space domain, the Space Force needed a more singular command and control structure for all its guardians. The problem set of the Space Force is different than the problem set of the Air Force and the Army. So the Personnel Management Act allows the Space Force to have that unity of command, and by doing so, reducing bureaucracy, synchronizing and harmonizing training and culture for all guardians, and the distinction in service models between full-time and part-time that exist maybe between regular and reserve components is not as important in terms of establishing lanes in the road of who does what. But what's more important is that back and forth flexibility to allow commanders to use personnel to the best extent possible based on their credentials, their qualifications, and their abilities. So that's the first piece of this is it's really important in the Space Force to have that unified command and control. The other reason why the Personnel Management Act was enacted, I think, is that it was a unique opportunity to implement what some have called a 21st century human capital management model. And that sounds like a buzzword, but I assure you it's not. Over the intervening decades since the Air Force was established, the Department of Defense, the services have been in constant change. They're still changing to this day. They changed the realities of our economy, our social structure, our adversaries, and the world geopolitics, if you will. So for the Space Force, looking at how they fit into that realm, they said, we have an opportunity to do things differently, not for the sake of doing them differently, but it's so hard to change existing models. Even when you're in constant change, it's small changes. So this is a chance for the Space Force and really the Department of Defense to take a look at, well, what kind of change could we implement rapidly? And leveraging the fact that the Space Force is new, is still building its culture, its organization, was the perfect time to take this leap and to see how that works. So It's of course really optimal for the Space Force based on the parameters we talked about of how the Space Force came into being and what its mission is. But it's a great model, perhaps for the Department of Defense in the future to look at. All right, as we look at change in other services or in other circumstances, it'll be a little less scary to figure out how to do that. Whether we're talking policy or human capital management systems, or even just fundamentally how Americans serve in the military.
No, thank you for that perspective. And before we get into some details about what the reserve component individuals' opportunities are within the Space Force, let's talk about the future workforce. Let's just say, for example, I know I'm probably too old to join the Space Force. However, if I want to join the Space Force, could I? Maybe let's just say I'm younger. Can I join the Space Force as a part-timer? How would that look?
Are you talking about somebody who's in the reserve today, or?
Yeah, just as somebody who's in industry who says, hey, I'd like to join the Space Force as a part-timer. Is that something that they can do, or is there an on-ramp for that, or are you still working through some of those processes?
Well, we're absolutely working through those processes, so appreciate your grace in that. But absolutely, that's the legislation makes that fully permissible, and we are implementing the policy right now for how that would work. I would say two things on that score. One of the original goals of the Personnel Management Act was that very thing, to be able to attract folks in industry and academia that have a deep space expertise, and to have them have a path to service in the Space Force, whether that's full-time or if that's part-time. So there are mechanisms for that. I think that dovetails with the Space Force's, like I said, unique operational focus. So building skills, and it's not one or the other. It's not space or intel or cyber. It's all of those things, because in the space mission set we found that they're all interrelated and critical pieces of knowledge that any space operations guardian will have to have. So building those skills and building pieces of those skills and bringing in, like I said, that experience that might come from outside. So we want to be able to attract that and retain that in the Space Force.
Oh, perfect. And really, some of the things you're hitting on that I think are critical, and other Space Force leaders have been talking about it, is the importance of culture. And so you talked a little bit about everyone, a Space Force professional. What does that really mean, and how does that impact culture? And what are the thoughts towards the future of and the vision of what the future force will look like?
So we don't know what the future force will look like. We're laying the foundation for what that will look like, and it's very exciting to explore the permutations. So in a service that Guardians have the ability to have a little bit of control over their career path, to maybe go from a full-time position into a part-time position, because that meets their needs. And for the Space Force, as they take that transition into part-time or back to full-time, to be able to leverage what that Guardian has to offer to the best of the Space Force's ability. That's really exciting. So I think that what we'll look at is what's the optimal way to use all Guardians, no matter what work role they just happen to be in right now. Focus on that and focus less on, well, what do we do with someone who's a part-time, member, maybe traditionally in a reserve component. How do we actualize that individual through a reserve unit? We will have the luxury of not having to do that, because all the Guardians will be in the force together. That comes, of course, with some complexity, but that's why I get paid, is to worry about how we're going to manage that kind of thing.
Yes, sir. And obviously you're wearing an Air Force tag on, so you're still part of the Air Force Reserve Command. How does the policies and procedures allow for folks to easily transition into, and we'll talk a little bit more about transitioning, but transition into a part-time status in the Space Force? And are you working through some of those policies that are needed to make it easy for folks to transition in as necessary or transition out? Yeah,
absolutely. So the vision we have is that the transition between full-time or part-time is as easy as taking an assignment. The way the Personnel Management Act is structured is that all Guardians that are participating, so are actively serving, are in active status together. So they're not in a separate component. There are much fewer, much less complicated mechanisms to making a transition than we might see typically between components. So that in and of itself lends itself to faster, more dynamic, more deliberate decisions of what's the best way for a Guardian to serve, what's the best participation schedule for them, and what's the best utility of that Guardian. So That doesn't come for free. We have to enact the policy at the Space Force, Department of the Air Force, and an OSD level to enact that. So all the policy that's been written to date has been written for a service that has a reserve and a regular component. And in law, we don't have that for the Space Force. So we're working through with partners at all those levels, what does that policy need to look like? So everyone's leaning forward into it. It's a great problem to have this vision you're trying to enact. But of course, coming at a time when we're gearing up for great power competition across the Department of the Air Force, and the Space Force is implementing a number of initiatives, it takes focus. So,
and the future workforce is so critical to the Space Force. So we need that expertise to be able to transition into the service to ensure we have not only the capabilities, but the human capital strategy to ensure we have those processes and procedures in place to ensure that freedom of action in the space domain. So I want to transition just a little bit. And by the way, we are conducting Q&A, so if you've got questions for Brigadier General Yates, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section of the webinar, and we will see if we can get to them. Good. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to have you, sir. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about folks that are already there, because I know there's a lot of questions, and I was a reservist. I finished up my career as a reservist, and I know there's a lot of questions that the folks have about how the Air Force Reserve members are able to apply for full-time positions within the Space Force. Can you say how many people applied and were selected, and kind of where are we at with regard to transitioning some of those folks over?
Yeah, absolutely. So because we won't have separate components, as part of the legislation, the plan we offered to Congress was that we would offer space professionals in the Air Force Reserve the opportunity to volunteer to transfer into the Space Force. In addition, we identified what we call the space footprint, or the portfolio of billets and units where we have those space professionals supporting the Space Force today from the Air Force Reserve, decrementing those positions from the Air Force Reserve and moving them over to the Space Force. So as a way to seed the full-time and part-time members that might come over from the Reserve. So right now, we're focused on the initial transfer of airmen from the Air Force Reserve with these space qualifications into the Space Force in a full-time status. The full-time status already exists in the Space Force, so from a policy perspective and a systems perspective and a management perspective, it was far easier. And folks were chomping at the bit, to be honest. We wanted to offer them that ability to transition, and there is work to be done in the Space Force that we can use those trained experts in the Reserve and use them as guardians today. So we've started that transition. So in June, we opened up an application window for members of the Air Force Reserve in any status, so whether they're full-time or part-time currently. And that window is open through the 30th of November. Actually, next week, we have our first review and selection panel of the initial applicants. So through the Personnel Management Act, we created about 300 new positions in the Space Force full-time. And I'm happy to say we've had over 300 actually apply for those positions from the Reserve. I think 330 or right about that number will meet that first review panel next week. So it's a great problem to have, and we're prioritizing the members that are in that affected space portfolio whose billets will transition as part of the PMA to make sure that if they're interested in transfer to the Space Force, there's a path to service for them. Otherwise, members that aren't interested, the Reserve is a great mission partner on this whole transition process, and has said, if they're space professionals and they want to move, we want them to move. If they would like to stay in the Reserve and retrain or take the skill set they have, maybe if it's something like intelligence where you could do that under the space portfolio or the air portfolio, find them a new position, so that will work for some people as well. So definitely working on that first, we call it tranche one for the full-time transfers, and working through that. Those members will get selected and verified and matched to an assignment here through the fall, and then we'll work to bring them over into the Space Force.
It seems like a lot that's being done to ensure the Reserve component and folks that are traditional reservists and Air Reserve technicians and even AGRs have a place to go, and you're setting that up for success. So have you heard from the field about any issues associated with that transfer? any problem sets that are presenting themselves?
I think that people have more questions about what service in a part-time role will look like, and it is something we're still working through. We are not recreating the reserve in the Space Force, so it will be different, and different can be interpreted as challenging to some people, but I also like to focus on the opportunities, because for current reservists, they've joined the reserve at some point in their career. Maybe they've transitioned off of service in the active, in the regular component first. But for future Guardians, they will join the Space Force as a Guardian, and they'll stay in that service, whether they transition to part-time or whether they stay full-time. So long-term, this will be very easy, be very well understood of what path I'm taking, what are those opportunities to serve in a full-time or part-time role. For the members in the reserve today, sure, it takes a little bit of a leap of faith to say, all right, well, I know what I know, but I don't know what's coming. So what I would offer them is it's going to be different, and different is sometimes a little bit challenging, but it opens up the possibility for opportunities. So for example, right now, if you're in the reserve component, it is very difficult to take a position in the active service to do things like a squadron command, or take a position of authority on a staff. It's just hard to do. It's not impossible. You can switch components, but there are challenges. We won't have those difficulties. So any Guardian at any point in their career, whether or not they happen to be full-time or part-time at the moment, if they want to take a position and they're the best qualified Guardian, they're going to be put in that position. So if you need to be part-time for a while, but then you see an opportunity that you want to take and that's full-time, that's not a problem. If you're full-time and you need to go part-time and see an opportunity you need to take, that's not a problem. Of course, there are limits. There are end strength boundaries and such that we'll work through like any service does. But that's the vision, and I think we can enact that.
Is it possible, and I'm sure you've done this already, to walk through a couple of case studies, examples? And I've heard other Space Force senior leaders talk about the criticality of partnering with industry because it is such a small force, to have them right next to us, right next to operators on console executing the Space Force's mission on a regular basis. So could you walk through just a couple of case studies where you see a Space Force member that sees an opportunity in the industry, and quite honestly, maybe the Space Force says, we want you to go into industry, and in the past it's been a fellowship, but maybe now it's deliberately an opportunity for folks to transition into the private sector. And then the opposite, you see somebody in the private sector doing some phenomenal work and you say, you'd be a great fit for the Space Force, come over and work part-time here. Have you kind of walked through some of those scenarios and what that would look like in terms of time frames, time commitments, those kind of things, realizing that obviously there are physical requirements to get into the military. So how are you addressing some of those concerns?
So I was thinking about that earlier, as a matter of fact, because I was thinking, and this is not a Space Force example, but bear with me. I was thinking back to what I think of as the most famous reservist. Actually, I Googled the most famous reservist, and I got Spock. Leonard Nimoy was the most famous reservist. But in my part of the business, we think of Jimmy Doolittle as the most famous reservist. But when you look back on his career, he spent half his career actually on active duty in the regular Army and Army Air Corps, and half as a reservist. So he's kind of actually prototypical of what we're talking about. And when he was on active duty, he went to MIT to get a degree. He did a aeronautics tour of South America. And then when he was in the reserve and he was part-time, he did some foundational doctrine and tactics development for the Army Air Corps. So talk about someone that kind of embrace the model we're trying to build, where it doesn't really matter, what service you're in. It doesn't matter what role you're in. We use you to the best of your ability. So what people bring to the Space Force is what we're interested in. So they'll develop that in the service. So a Guardian joins the Space Force, develops an initial operational skill set, through their training, their operational tour. And then at that point, they'll have maybe a decision to go full-time or part-time. Why would they go part-time? If they have a personal situation that makes sense for, great. But they might also because they're looking to explore an option out in industry or academia. What we're hoping then is that will come back to the Space Force. So we want to offer them an ability to leverage the skills they have in their part-time work role and keep serving, but also to bring that skill back. And it's really not that different than how the military thinks about other things. So language skills, we send very few people back to school for language training, but we're really happy to leverage language skills that people develop. And we don't care how they've developed them, if they studied it in college or they grew up with that language. So same kind of focus. When someone brings a qualification back with them, maybe they're an expert in astrophysics or hypersonics, we want to figure out how to reward them for that skill and leverage that skill in their service, whether or not they're serving part-time or serving full-time.
Thank you for that, sir. No, and you're right. We've got to leverage the capability that inherently comes from the private sector as they evolve in terms of technology. Let's kind of go back to how reservists are kind of being assessed into the Space Force. So can you talk a little bit about, as you go through the selection process, how many of the members are on different statuses, whether it's AGR, TRs, or IMAs, and when you select those folks, how many of those members will have to PCS to take their offered position? So can you talk a little bit about statuses, where you're currently at with that, and then the PCS requirements?
Sure. So for the group that is meeting the selection and review panel next week, because we had a cutoff date to accept applications, and then further applications have come in, and those members will be considered at a subsequent board that will meet in November, and then we even have a third one that meets in January to make sure that we've given the Space Force enough time to fully think through, who do we need, what's the best folks to bring over, and to give the members who are interested in applying but maybe need more information a couple other opportunities to sit back and make sure this is right for them, because we want it to be right for people. I think that, I don't recall the exact numbers, over half of the applicants are currently full-time members, mostly AGRs, a couple of Air Reserve technicians, and the rest are members who are currently serving as either TRs or IMAs. So all welcome, and the primary qualification we're looking for is space experience. And this serves both the Space Force and the Air Force Reserve, that if a member is maybe interested in the Space Force but they don't have a space experience, their path is probably better suited in the Air Force Reserve, and there are plenty of great opportunities for them. So we want to make sure we're bringing over the right folks, and by contrast, the right cohort is also staying with the Air Force Reserve. No,
that makes sense. In terms of, I'm sure the units are saying, hey, we need more resources down at the field command and Delta levels. I'm sure plenty of opportunities for them to say, hey, we could use some help. So as you look forward into the vision of how to implement this, how many are going to be incorporated into current units, and what units are going to be prioritized? Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, so the Space Force has been fortunate in that their manning has been really healthy. A lot of interest in the Space Force, so that's fantastic. But that said, there's certainly a demand signal for more work that has to be done. Example, just the Personnel Management Act implementation, is a project maybe that hadn't been expected and needed to be staffed. Space Force is innovating with its command structure, with its force presentation model. It's innovating with its acquisition model as well, and also how it develops Guardians, just the basic foundational training and culture. So a lot of things going on, and the folks that are coming over with space experience, I think, will be able to contribute materially in many, if not all, of those areas. So as we look at where does the Space Force have a need for additional Guardians, that lines straight in, with the existing manpower work that is done, that is coordinated through DoD and with Congress as well, in terms of how big the Space Force should be and where does it need to have folks.
Oh, thank you so much. And when we talk about incorporating those part-time, is it reasonable to believe that all Space Force units will have part-time positions? And when might we start seeing widespread use of part-time positions within the Space Force?
Where I think that we will see part-time positions is potentially anywhere in the Space Force where work needs done. So to answer your question, yes, it could be. Whether or not we will have part-time positions in a certain unit depends on, I think, two things. One is if there is work there that needs to be done in a part-time capacity. Because if there's not, then that's not a good fit. And there are plenty other places where we probably can find a good fit. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that because these are work roles and not a status, so no one is identified as a full-timer or as a part-timer, and they might transition, back and forth. We need to look at their career progression and their career development. So Space Force will have the luxury of first starting with its requirements. What do we need to do to be an effective fighting force? But then looking at what do our Guardians need? So maybe I make the decision to say, Bill Wolf at this point of his career needs this assignment. Can I enable that with a full-time role, with a part-time role? So it's both requirement-based and Guardian-based. So, but to answer your basic question, potentially anywhere in the Space Force, if part-time makes sense, we would have the ability to have a part-time billet there.
And how does that, we just got a question about the civilian service. So are you looking at civil service transfers from civil service potentially over to active duty status and vice versa?
We're not looking at that. We have, of course, been focused on the near-term transition from the Air Force Reserve just because we're pulling some positions from the Reserve into the Space Force as part of the Personnel Management Act and asking volunteers if they want to come over. But really what we're doing with the Personnel Management Act is enabling a structure for the Space Force writ large. So future Guardians will have that ability and that decision to switch status. But we had not looked at transfers between a civilian and a military status at this point.
Well, thank you for that. There's plenty of organizations established in Air Force Reserve Command to support duties of Air Force Space Command. And we know Air Force Space Command is gone. What will happen to those units, and when does the Space Force envision standing down Air Force Reserve Space Squadrons and potentially the 310 Space Wing?
Yeah, great question. So when Congress enacted the Personnel Management Act, they gave us a window through 2028 to implement. So that is our target. So as we transition from now through 2028, we're looking at those very things. When do the reserve associate units that exist and provide valuable mission support continuity today, when is it right for those units to maybe transition to do something else or to stand down and writ large the space wing that's in the Reserve Command? So a lot of those decisions are really solidly in the lane of the Reserve. So I could only speculate of when we'll see change, but how that change will look, whether the wing stands down or transitions to a new mission, is something that the Reserve is working through established policies and processes. So more to follow on that.
Very cool. So you have time is the point to that. So we just got a question from the audience. When will selected members from the first board of Tranche 1 be notified of their selection after you do the review process next week?
It takes a little while to make sure to validate the board, the panel selection, and then members that are initially selected as a good fit for transfer will be matched to an assignment called a soft match, because the members do not have to commit to joining the Space Force until they've been identified of what that assignment is, where it is, and once they know, only then do they have to make the decision of whether or not to transfer. Once they decide to transfer, then we start all the behind-the-scenes personnel actions to make that transfer effective. So on the order of months to make sure that we've done the process properly, judiciously, selected the right folks for the right reasons, and then make initial notifications and start doing the assignment matching with our Enterprise Talent Management Office. So, and then when we would start seeing the members actually transition and sworn in as Guardians depends on a few processes. The officers have to scroll into the Space Force. There are some actions to separate from the Reserve service for the purposes of going into the Space Force. So along those timelines, it can vary based on a couple of factors, but we're excited to have those new Guardians in place here over the next several months and get them up to speed.
A tremendous opportunity for folks to bring their expertise into the Space Force for sure. We got a question from the audience. Senior at Virginia Tech, looking for a job in aerospace engineering and full-time position in the Space Force. What I'd suggest to that individual is reach out to your recruiter and go to U.S. Space Force website and to see about starting your career in the Space Force. Now, I will say, for those people who can't join the Space Force, and it was indicated that I'm not being invited to the Space Force, which is fine. There's a professional organization called the Space Force Association that you can be a part of. And one of the programs that we started is the Space Professional Society, which is focused at the university students who want to start their space careers. So regardless of the opportunity to join the Space Force, you can definitely be an advocate for the Space Force through the Space Force Association. And so I do want to focus a little bit on because I know there's plenty of discussion about the Guard out there. So there's been dialogue recently about a Space National Guard. Can you just comment on that, or just let Congress continue to work their efforts in figuring out what is going to be written into law?
I think that's it. So the Personnel Management Act that was enacted was purely focused on the Air Force Reserve and did not direct any activity with regard to the Air National Guard. But the NDAA did direct a study, so that study's been done, delivered to Congress, and they're currently working through, I think, what's the way forward there. So.
Yep, still plenty to do there. So these Space Warfighter Talks are a way we help get information out to the community for folks who may not know about the Space Force, because there's a lot of intersection between civil, private, national security space. And so SFA is here to help provide that information. So if this Space Warfighter Talk has been interesting and compelling to you, please go to our YouTube channel where you can see over 100 interviews that we've accomplished over the past 5 years here at SFA. Also, some other exciting events that are coming up at SFA are our Space Power Conference. I know we talked about you maybe getting down to our Space Power Conference in Orlando on 10th through 12th, but realizing you've got some heavy lifting to do between now and then, I don't know that we'll be able to see you, but I'm hoping to see you down there. I'm
hoping so too. I think it'll be exciting and important discussions that take place, so hopefully you will see me there. And
for those here in the DC area, the DC chapter of the Space Force Association is hosting a Golfing for Guardians event on September 23rd at Fort Belvoir golf course. So if you're in the local area and want to support Guardians, please come out to the Golfing for Guardians event on September 23rd. So General Yates, I don't see any other questions here. I really do appreciate your time today and taking time out of what I know is your busy schedule to talk really about what's happening with the Personnel Management Act, because I know there's been a lot of questions about what the future of the force is going to look like, and I really like the point that you made about the Guardians helping to develop the culture that they want based on the vision of what the Space Force is going to be in the future.
Well, Bill, it's a pleasure to sit down with you, catch up a little bit, and to talk about the Personnel Management Act, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much, sir, and we'll talk to you real soon.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you at the next Space Warfighter Talk.